Part 1. At first, the radar operator thought it was a glitch, just another blip lost in the static of the open sea, but within seconds the silence inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln snapped into full alert, screens lighting up, voices tightening, and a single realization settling in like a cold weight. Something was watching them. The aircraft carrier cut through the dark waters with quiet authority, a floating city of steel and firepower, but tonight the ocean felt different, charged, as if history itself had decided to lean closer and listen. The unidentified object moved with purpose, steady, controlled, and unmistakably unmanned. This was no fishing drone, no civilian curiosity. This was military. And it was closing in. The order to track came instantly. Technicians locked onto the signal while officers leaned forward, eyes fixed on data streams that told a story no one wanted to misread. The drone's altitude, speed, and vector suggested surveillance, a deliberate test of boundaries. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen operators were watching the same numbers, measuring reactions, probing resolve. In that moment, the Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a carrier group on routine operations. It was a message. And messages, in this part of the world, were never simple. As the drone edged closer, memories of past encounters surfaced across the bridge. Incidents in the Gulf, near misses, warnings ignored, red lines blurred and redrawn until they barely existed. This region had learned to live on the edge of escalation, where one wrong move could ripple across continents. The crew knew the rules of engagement, knew the cost of hesitation and the danger of overreaction. Every second mattered. Every decision would echo far beyond the deck plates beneath their boots. The drone's profile became clearer. Sleek, compact, designed for endurance rather than speed. Its sensors were likely sweeping the carrier strike group, mapping defenses, recording electronic signatures, building a picture that could be used later. This wasn't about today. This was about tomorrow. Intelligence officers exchanged glances that said everything without words. This was Iranian. Not suspected. Not possible. Iranian. The patterns matched. The technology matched. And the timing matched a growing tension that had been simmering for months. Command escalated the situation up the chain. Reports moved fast, stripped of emotion, heavy with implication. The carrier group adjusted formation subtly, a silent choreography practiced countless times for moments exactly like this. Fighter jets stood Part 2. The order did not come as a shout or a dramatic command, it came quietly, deliberately, spoken in a tone that carried the full authority of responsibility as the commanding officer authorized advanced countermeasures, a step designed not to destroy but to warn, not to provoke but to protect. Electronic warfare systems surged, invisible waves reaching out toward the approaching drone, attempting to disrupt its sensors, its communications, its ability to see and report what it had been sent to observe. For a brief moment, there was hope that the message would be understood and that the machine would turn away, mission complete, tension diffused. Instead, the drone adjusted. Its course shifted just enough to compensate, stabilizing itself as if anticipating interference, confirming fears that this was no simple surveillance platform but a hardened system prepared for contested environments. Inside the Combat Information Center, that subtle correction spoke louder than any alarm. This drone was not merely observing. It was testing. It was learning. And it was reporting in real time. Fighter pilots received updated instructions, their breathing steady, their focus absolute. Launch was an option, but not yet a necessity. Every second bought through restraint mattered. Diplomatic channels remained open somewhere far above this deck, but out here on the water, decisions belonged to those closest to the threat. The drone's altitude dipped slightly, then leveled out again, a maneuver that erased any lingering doubt about intent. It was pushing boundaries deliberately, inch by inch. Intelligence analysts worked at a relentless pace, cross-referencing live data with previous encounters. Similar drones had been used to shadow naval vessels, to provoke reactions that could later be framed as aggression. This pattern was familiar, but familiarity did not make it harmless. The carrier strike group represented one of the most powerful military assets on Earth, and power drew attention, challenge, and risk in equal measure. As the drone closed the distance further, warnings escalated from procedural to unmistakable. Radio messages were transmitted on multiple frequencies, clear, professional, and firm, identifying the carrier group and demanding immediate course alteration. There was no response. Not even static. Just silence, and the continued approach of an unmanned aircraft whose operators were clearly listening. Below deck, sailors went about their duties with disciplined calm, but the tension was palpable, an undercurrent that ran through every passageway. This was not a training exercise. This was not hypothetical. The consequences of the next decision would be felt far beyond the steel walls of the ship. The Abraham Lincoln had been designed to project power, but tonight it was also projecting restraint, and restraint, paradoxically, was the harder posture to maintain. Then the drone crossed another threshold. This boundary, unlike the others, was operationally unacceptable. At this range, sensitive systems could be mapped in dangerous detail. Defensive capabilities could be analyzed. Weaknesses could be inferred. The risk was no longer abstract. It was immediate and measurable. The commanding officer reviewed the final assessment, the recommendations unanimous now. The drone had been warned. It had been challenged. It had refused to disengage. Authorization was given. The decision moved through the chain instantly, transforming from words into action. A fighter jet roared off the deck, its engines cutting through the night, a visible reminder that the situation had shifted. The jet closed in fast, its presence undeniable, executing a maneuver meant to compel compliance without firing a shot. For a fraction of a second, it seemed as though the drone might finally retreat. Instead, it held course. That moment erased any remaining ambiguity. This was no accident. This was defiance. The jet repositioned, sensors locked, awaiting final clearance. The carrier group watched as the distance closed, as the window for safe resolution narrowed to a breath. Somewhere far away, decision makers would later analyze this moment frame by frame, but out here there was no pause button, no rewind, only the weight of responsibility and the ticking clock of escalation. The command came through. The missile struck with precision, a brief flash against the dark sky, and then the drone was gone, fragments falling silently into the sea below. The engagement lasted seconds, but its impact was immediate. The sky cleared. The immediate threat was neutralized. The carrier strike group maintained course, disciplined and steady, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everyone aboard knew the truth. This was not the end. This was the opening move. As reports began flowing upward through military and political channels, as radar screens returned to normal patterns, and as the ocean reclaimed its calm surface, a new phase had begun. The drone's destruction would not go unnoticed. It would be analyzed, debated, and responded to. And somewhere beyond the horizon, plans were already forming. The night swallowed the last trace of debris, but the consequences were only just rising, and the USS Abraham Lincoln sailed forward into a future that had become far more uncertain than it had been only minutes before. End of Part 2. Part 3. The confirmation echoed through the carrier strike group with clinical clarity, target neutralized, no further contacts detected, yet the sense of relief that might have followed such a report never fully arrived, because everyone involved understood that destruction in this context was not an ending but a signal, one that would travel fast and land hard in rooms far removed from the ocean's surface. The USS Abraham Lincoln continued on its course, engines steady, formation intact, but the psychological terrain had shifted, and the crew felt it in the way conversations stayed brief and eyes lingered longer on their screens. Within minutes, encrypted communications surged outward from the carrier, carrying precise timelines, sensor data, and engagement details to commanders and analysts across multiple time zones. Each packet of information added clarity while simultaneously raising new questions. The drone had not transmitted a distress signal. There had been no attempt at retreat. Its behavior suggested that its operators had anticipated the outcome and accepted it. That realization unsettled even the most seasoned officers. This had not been a mistake. It had been a calculated sacrifice. In intelligence centers far from the sea, analysts replayed the engagement repeatedly, slowing down the footage, examining every adjustment the drone made before impact. Its resilience to electronic interference stood out immediately, as did its deliberate flight path. This was not reconnaissance in the traditional sense. It was reconnaissance paired with provocation. The drone had gathered what it could, but just as importantly, it had forced a response, capturing reaction times, engagement protocols, and tactical decision-making under pressure. Public awareness followed swiftly. News alerts broke across networks, headlines forming narratives before full facts could settle. Statements were prepared, measured carefully to balance transparency with restraint. The language was precise, emphasizing defensive action, adherence to international norms, and the safety of personnel. Yet beneath the calm wording lay an undeniable truth. A line had been crossed, and it had been enforced with force. Across the region, military units adjusted their posture. Radar systems scanned a little farther. Patrols tightened. Communications traffic increased. Allies sought briefings. Adversaries issued statements that condemned while carefully avoiding commitments. The incident became a focal point, a reference that would frame discussions for days, weeks, and perhaps longer. The drone was gone, but its absence was loud. Aboard the Abraham Lincoln, operations resumed with disciplined normalcy, but the crew was acutely aware that they were now operating under heightened scrutiny. Every maneuver, every transmission, every routine action carried added significance. The ship had become a symbol overnight, not by intention, but by circumstance. Sailors understood that their professionalism in the hours ahead mattered as much as the split-second decisions that had already been made. Intelligence updates began to filter back down. Increased drone activity had been detected elsewhere in the region, not approaching directly, but probing, observing, repositioning. Naval commanders weighed possibilities, distinguishing coincidence from coordination. The pattern suggested adjustment, not retreat. The loss of one asset had not deterred further interest. It had refined it. Behind closed doors, strategic discussions intensified. The engagement was legal. The response was justified. Yet the broader implications demanded careful handling. Retaliation could take many forms, not all of them immediate or overt. Cyber domains, proxy forces, economic pressure, and political maneuvering all loomed as possible avenues. The incident had expanded the field of play. As night turned toward morning, the ocean reflected a pale light, indifferent to the calculations unfolding above it. The carrier group maintained vigilance, fully aware that escalation rarely announced itself clearly. It crept in through patterns, through shifts in behavior, through small changes that only made sense in retrospect. The drone had been a test, and tests were rarely administered only once. The Abraham Lincoln pressed forward, a constant amid uncertainty, while planners and operators alike prepared for what might come next, knowing that the decision to defend the ship had closed one chapter but opened several others, each more complex than the last. And somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen and unheard, the response to the downed drone was already taking shape. End of Part 3 PART 4. The response did not arrive with missiles or aircraft, and it did not announce itself with sirens or radar spikes, because the most effective retaliation rarely does. It began quietly, almost invisibly, as subtle anomalies crept into regional communication networks, brief disruptions that were easy to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore when viewed together. Data links flickered for fractions of a second. Satellite feeds experienced momentary degradation. Navigation signals wavered just enough to demand attention. None of it caused damage, but all of it carried intent. Aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, cyber and electronic warfare specialists flagged the irregularities immediately. This was not random interference. The signatures were deliberate, probing, designed to test resilience rather than cripple systems. The message was unmistakable. The downing of the drone had been acknowledged, and the reply had begun, not with force, but with pressure. Regional commanders elevated alert levels across the strike group. Defensive postures shifted again, this time toward domains less visible to the naked eye but equally critical. The battlefield was expanding, stretching beyond air and sea into networks, signals, and information flow. The drone incident had crossed from tactical engagement into strategic contest. Intelligence briefings grew more frequent and more urgent. Analysts connected the disruptions to known Iranian cyber units and electronic warfare capabilities. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. This was retaliation without fingerprints, escalation without explosions, a reminder that modern conflict rarely followed old rules. The goal was not destruction. It was influence. Meanwhile, political pressure mounted. Allies demanded assurances. Markets reacted nervously. Statements from regional actors grew sharper in tone while carefully avoiding explicit threats. Each word released publicly was weighed against its potential to inflame or calm. Privately, however, there was little doubt that the situation was entering a dangerous phase, one where misinterpretation could be as damaging as aggression. On the carrier, the crew adapted quickly. Backup systems were verified. Manual redundancies were rehearsed. Training kicked in, replacing uncertainty with action. Sailors understood that vigilance was no longer episodic but continuous. The Abraham Lincoln was not just defending itself now. It was demonstrating endurance. Then came the report that changed the tone of the room. Another drone had launched. This one did not head directly toward the carrier group. Instead, it paralleled their movement at a distance, staying just outside engagement thresholds, visible enough to be detected but far enough to complicate response. It was accompanied by unusual surface vessel activity farther south, fast-moving craft that altered course frequently, creating a web of potential threats without committing to any single one. The intent was clear. This was pressure applied from multiple angles, designed to stretch attention, to force constant evaluation, to wear down decision makers. It was escalation by exhaustion. Commanders assessed options carefully. Engaging the new drone immediately risked reinforcing a cycle of action and reaction. Ignoring it entirely risked appearing hesitant. The balance between firmness and restraint narrowed further. Every move would be interpreted not only by the adversary but by allies watching closely for signals of resolve. As daylight fully broke, the ocean revealed a theater far more crowded than it had been the night before. Airspace was busy with patrols. Surface contacts multiplied. The calm had vanished, replaced by controlled tension, a sense that events were accelerating toward a point that could no longer be managed quietly. Inside the command center, the understanding settled in with uncomfortable clarity. The incident was no longer about a single drone or even a single carrier. It was about credibility, about deterrence, about who controlled the narrative of power in this region. The Abraham Lincoln had become the focal point of a contest much larger than itself. And as the second drone held its distant shadowing position, as networks continued to flicker and the regional chessboard filled with pieces, one question dominated every calculation. How far would this go before someone forced it to end? End of Part 4. Part 5. The tension reached a point where waiting became its own risk, because in modern conflict hesitation could be misread as weakness just as easily as action could be framed as aggression, and commanders across the region understood that the next step had to be deliberate, visible, and controlled. The second drone remained at its calculated distance, neither retreating nor advancing, while surface contacts continued their erratic movements, forming a pattern that looked less like coincidence and more like choreography. High-level coordination intensified. Naval commanders synchronized with regional allies, sharing real-time intelligence and aligning response options. This was no longer a single-ship decision. It was a coalition moment, one that demanded unity as much as strength. The message forming behind closed doors was clear. Surveillance would not be tolerated when it crossed into intimidation, but escalation would not be allowed to spiral unchecked. On the Abraham Lincoln, orders were refined. The carrier group adjusted its route slightly, a move subtle enough to avoid provocation but noticeable enough to demonstrate freedom of maneuver. Fighter patrols expanded their perimeter. Electronic countermeasures remained active, tuned carefully to avoid collateral disruption. Every action was measured, every signal intentional. The second drone responded by altering its own path, maintaining distance but increasing altitude, extending its sensor reach. This adjustment confirmed what many had suspected. The objective was no longer simple observation. It was presence. A declaration that the region was contested, that dominance would be challenged not in dramatic clashes but in persistent pressure. Then came a development that shifted the balance. Diplomatic channels, quiet but relentless, began to show signs of traction. Back-channel communications conveyed unease, not apology, but recognition. The loss of the first drone had been absorbed. The ongoing standoff, however, carried risks that neither side could fully control. Messages were exchanged that emphasized restraint without concession, signaling a shared interest in preventing a rapid slide into open conflict. Almost simultaneously, cyber activity in the region began to taper. Network disruptions lessened. Signal interference declined. The invisible pressure eased just enough to be felt. It was not a withdrawal, but it was a pause, and pauses in these situations were meaningful. Aboard the carrier, the change did not bring relaxation. Instead, it brought heightened awareness. This was the most dangerous phase, the moment when de-escalation could either take hold or collapse under a single misstep. Commanders maintained posture, refusing to interpret reduced pressure as safety. The crew stayed sharp, knowing that history was filled with conflicts that ignited precisely when leaders assumed the worst had passed. Hours later, the second drone finally shifted course more decisively, increasing its distance and turning away from the carrier group's path. It did not leave the region entirely, but its shadow no longer loomed directly. Surface contacts dispersed gradually, their movements returning to patterns consistent with routine patrols rather than provocation. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The point had been made. The response had been received. Neither side had gained a decisive advantage, but both had tested boundaries and survived the test without crossing into open conflict. As the Abraham Lincoln continued its mission, intelligence assessments framed the standoff as a controlled escalation that had stopped just short of breaking. Lessons were already being drawn, tactics refined, doctrines reconsidered. The region remained tense, but the immediate trajectory had shifted away from confrontation. Still, no one believed the story was finished. The events of the past days had altered perceptions, adjusted expectations, and hardened positions in ways that would not fade quickly. The downed drone, the cyber pressure, the shadowing presence all formed a narrative that would shape decisions going forward. And as the carrier group sailed on, maintaining vigilance under a watchful sky, the final outcome of this encounter had yet to be fully realized, its true resolution waiting just ahead. End of Part 5 Part 6. The shift from confrontation to cautious distance did not erase the consequences of what had already occurred, because in strategic contests the aftermath often mattered more than the incident itself, and across military and political circles the events surrounding the USS Abraham Lincoln were being dissected with intense focus. The immediate crisis had eased, but the long-term recalibration had begun, and it unfolded quietly, deliberately, and with lasting intent. Intelligence reports compiled the full picture. The first drone's mission parameters, the second drone's shadowing behavior, the coordinated cyber pressure, and the gradual pullback all pointed to a single conclusion. This had been a controlled escalation designed to probe, resolve, gather data, and send a signal without triggering war. The United States response, firm but restrained, had returned that signal with equal clarity. Boundaries existed, and they would be enforced. Aboard the Abraham Lincoln, the operational tempo normalized, but nothing truly returned to routine. Training incorporated lessons learned almost immediately. Communication protocols were refined. Electronic warfare procedures were adjusted to account for the resilience displayed by the drone systems. The crew understood that the next encounter, whether days or months away, would not look exactly like the last one. Adaptation was already underway on both sides. Diplomatic engagement intensified behind the scenes. Statements released publicly emphasized stability and professionalism, but privately the tone was sharper, more candid. Each side conveyed its red lines without advertising them, reinforcing deterrence through understanding rather than rhetoric. The absence of further provocation suggested that the message had landed where it was intended. Regional allies took note as well. Naval forces increased joint patrols, not as a show of aggression, but as a demonstration of cohesion. Intelligence sharing deepened. The incident became a case study in modern deterrence, cited in briefings as an example of how quickly technology-driven encounters could escalate and how carefully they had to be managed. Then came confirmation that the operators responsible for the downed drone had stood down from elevated alert status. It was a small indicator, buried deep in classified reporting, but it mattered. It suggested closure, at least for now. The encounter had reached its natural endpoint, not with victory claimed loudly by either side, but with mutual recognition of limits. For the sailors aboard the Abraham Lincoln, this realization carried a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had done exactly what they were trained to do: protect the ship, uphold international norms, and avoid unnecessary escalation. Their actions would never be fully visible to the public, but their impact would shape decisions long after the headlines faded. As the carrier group continued its deployment, the sea once again appeared calm, its surface betraying none of the calculations that had recently unfolded above and below it. The sky was clear, the horizon open, yet the memory of the drone remained, not as a threat, but as a reminder of how close the world could come to conflict in the age of unmanned systems and instant reaction. The story was nearing its end, not because tension had vanished, but because balance had been restored, at least temporarily. The incident had tested restraint, readiness, and resolve, and it had proven that escalation was not inevitable, even in moments charged with risk. Ahead lay the final accounting, the understanding of what this encounter truly meant, and how it would shape the future of operations in contested regions. The resolution was close now. End of Part 6 Part 7. The final resolution did not arrive in the form of a treaty signing, a public apology, or a dramatic declaration of victory, because modern confrontations rarely end that way. Instead, it settled and gradually, confirmed by absence rather than presence, by what no longer happened. Days passed without new drone launches. Electronic interference faded entirely. Surface activity returned to predictable, unremarkable patterns. The region remained tense, but the confrontation itself had concluded. For decision makers on all sides, the outcome was clear. The downing of the drone near the USS Abraham Lincoln had established a boundary, and the measured response that followed had reinforced it without pushing the situation beyond control. Neither side had backed down publicly, yet both had adjusted privately. Deterrence had functioned as intended, not through overwhelming force, but through clarity and restraint. Official assessments framed the incident as a success in crisis management. The rules of engagement had been followed. International law had been respected. Most importantly, escalation had been avoided. The carrier strike group had continued its mission uninterrupted, projecting stability rather than dominance, and that distinction mattered. Power, when exercised carefully, could prevent conflict rather than invite it. Within military circles, the event became a reference point. Training materials were updated. Simulations incorporated the drone's behavior and the cyber tactics that followed. Commanders studied the timeline, noting how quickly a single unmanned aircraft had triggered a chain of global attention. The lesson was unmistakable. In an era of advanced surveillance and instant communication, even minor encounters carried strategic weight. Aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, life moved forward. Sailors returned fully to their routines, but with a sharpened sense of purpose. They had stood at the edge of escalation and held the line, not with hesitation, but with discipline. Their actions would never be summarized in a single headline, but they had shaped outcomes far beyond the deck they stood on. Public attention eventually shifted elsewhere, as it always did, yet the quiet impact of the incident endured. Diplomatic channels remained open. Military postures adjusted subtly. Expectations on both sides had been recalibrated. The message sent by the carrier group had been received, understood, and absorbed into future planning. The ocean rolled on, indifferent to borders and politics, while the Abraham Lincoln sailed steadily across it, a reminder that presence alone could influence events without firing a shot. The drone that had once hovered near its path was gone, but its legacy remained in the caution it inspired and the balance it reinforced. In the end, the story was not about a weapon destroyed or a threat eliminated. It was about control, about decision-making under pressure, and about the thin line that separates vigilance from violence. That line had held. And as the carrier disappeared into the horizon, its mission intact and its course unchanged, the chapter closed not with conflict, but with resolve, proving that even in the most contested waters, restraint could still shape the future. End of Part 7.